Hi, church, and welcome to the book of Habakkuk, week 2. So I wanted to start with a story. I know we're in Habakkuk. It's an interesting kind of book of the Bible. Hopefully you kind of have discovered, whether by looking it up or in your home church, that Habakkuk is one of the 13 minor prophets. And what's fascinating about the minor prophets, it's the word from God to the prophets. And then most of the books, it's the prophet is then relaying to the people the message of God. What we discovered in the home church that I visited this past week was what's interesting. Another thing that's interesting about the minor prophets is that the minor prophets aren't just written to the nation of Israel, but they're written to people like Nineveh, which is the Assyrians, and there's other different groups that, the Old Testament's all about God's people, nation of Israel, and God interacting, but we see in the minor prophets kind of like the promise that was given in Genesis 12, that all the nations will be blessed because of Abraham. And so we start to see that, or rather continue to see that come to fruition, that the words of God of warning to these various peoples weren't just to the nation of Israel, but were to lots of different people. And so that should remind us that the redemption message from God is for all mankind, and it is as relevant today, or then, as it is today. So Habakkuk it's another unique minor prophet in that it's never Habakkuk going to the people. Habakkuk is actually just talking to God, and so it's Habakkuk's complaint, the Lord's reply. Habakkuk's complaint, the Lord's reply, and this happens 3 times. And so today we're actually looking at Habakkuk's second complaint. And if you remember from the first week, last week he's saying, God, don't you see what's going on? Don't you see the violence? Don't you see how the government is failing the people? No one is living according to your words. It's violence in the streets. The courts have broken down. Our society is in crumbles. Lord, don't you see? Why don't you act? Why don't you do something? And I think that's just the most common cry that we have to God. When we are in tight places, when we are in points of tension, our cry is often, God, don't you see? And I hope we find ourselves incredibly comforted when we read in Scripture that God's like, I'm right here. I see you. I know. I may not be acting in the way you think I should, or I may not be taking actions that you see, but I'm here and I see you, and I know. I think of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew, chapters 5, 6, and 7. Jesus is like, he knows when a sparrow passes. He knows the number of hairs on your head. He knows what's going on in your life. He knows and he cares. So that's this idea with Habakkuk, is that we have a sovereign God. We have an all-powerful God. We have a God that cares. He's involved. And so I was in Weaverville this week, as I am most days of the week. Our office is next to Town Hall. And so if you don't know the Weaverville Town Hall, it's just a sleepy, quiet little place. They're very friendly. The police station is in the back of it, and so it's this nice, modern-looking building, and really is just nice to look at. And I've had to go over there a few times. I've gotten to go over there just to ask about some questions and stuff like that. Really great people, like super lovely. Well, it's also a polling location, and so for the past, since October 15th, I think, there's been signs out front about like who they want you to vote for, and there's been some people like manning the place and people lined up wanting to vote and stuff like that. And honestly, it's just been neat to see. It's been this very interesting to see the diversity of the signs, and some of them are kind of funny. There was one I saw the other day, and I don't know what it said, something like four more years of the same or 4 more years of change. And I couldn't figure out who they wanted me to vote for based on the sign, but that's besides the point. Last week, however, the sleepy town hall and the calm election process, I go by there the other day and it was electrified. I'm talking like to the point where I was a little bit uncomfortable being like walking past on the sidewalk by just the buzz that was in the air. I just felt this tension, and there was so many people there, but very few lined up to vote. And the environment, I mean, honestly, just felt very hostile. And thinking about Habakkuk and what we're teaching about all nations are eventually going to stray from God. All nations are also going to be able to be used by God. It struck me about how adamant and passionate these people were about who was going to rule them. And I know we don't think about our elections that way, like that we get to elect who's going to rule us. But Habakkuk had painted my narrative in that way. And so I'm looking forward to today, and the key verse is going to be Habakkuk 2:5, and it basically says, "The righteous shall live by faith." So if you're looking for the finish line, it's that the righteous shall live by faith. So just to recap, this is in 722, the northern tribes were invaded by the Assyrians. The Assyrians hauled them off, took them various places. We never heard from those tribes again. They're called the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Well, the southern tribes prevailed. The tribe of Judah was one of those tribes, and if that sounds familiar, that's because we know that Jesus was the Lion of Judah, like Jesus was in the line of Judah, and so he was going to be the coming king. And so it's very important that this tribe survives for the promise of the Messiah to come. And the Jewish people knew this and were aware of this. And so that happened. The northern tribes happened in 722. And about 130 years later, the Chaldeans came in, or the Babylonians is probably what you are aware of them as. So they are this new invader, this up-and-coming world power that's coming, and Israel kind of like sees them off in the distance as this storm cloud coming. And so they know it's coming. Militarily, they just know there's not much they can do about it. They are sweeping through the world, and Israel knows it's really just a matter of time before their time is up. And so this book, Habakkuk, predates Daniel. If you remember, Daniel is taken kind of captive by this people, this invading Babylonian group. He works for them. He rises in rank. Because of him, the Jewish people are spared. The religious cultures are kept in place. They're eventually, by the next invading people, sent back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, the very temple that Jesus would go and visit. So we see this plan of God working out. It may not be the plan of man, but we see this linear thing happen as we look back on history, and we see God's hand in it. And so this is Habakkuk, and he has looked out over the people, and he said, God, do something. And so God comes back and says, I'm going to do something. I'm sending the Babylonians to invade you. And so this is Habakkuk's reply. He says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. We shall not die. And he continues on. For, O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. And the first thing I want us to notice about this passage is even in the reply to the warning that, hey, the Babylonians are coming and they are a violent people, they are a wicked people, Habakkuk is quick to declare things about God. The first name of God, he says, is you are the everlasting God. And I kind of dug into this word. I wanted to do a research into the word to kind of pull out the richer meaning. And fascinatingly enough, this word, it stands alone. This word is a word that Habakkuk used to describe God that doesn't have a way to research it. So this is just Habakkuk saying, oh God, you are eternal. You are from nothing. You are eternal. You are powerful. You are everlasting. And then he says, oh Lord, my God, my Holy 1. And he's about to say some things that God is going to use the Babylonian people to do. He's about to, in his mind, be confronted with some harsh truths about the punishment, the chastisement from God that's going to come to his people. And so he's reminding himself of the holiness of God, that God is perfect, that God is without sin, that God is non-approachable in this area according to his holiness and his righteousness. He is set apart. He is not touchable in this. And so while we as believers and followers of God are free to question God, free to have doubts of God, the scriptures are filled, like I think of Psalms, and how often the psalmist would just cry out to God, like, God, I don't understand. God, do this, do that. God, I don't understand the position I've been put in. And God replies and gives an answer. You've heard me mention this before, like Thomas, the Apostle Thomas. After Jesus has been crucified, Thomas didn't see Jesus for some time, and he started to hear the reports and the questions about, or the reports that Jesus was resurrected. And Thomas says the famous words, well, I'll believe you when I touch him. I'll believe you when I touch the holes. And so therefore we call people that doubting Thomas. But we always fail to tell the second half of that story, is that Jesus met doubting Thomas right where he was at and put out his arms and said, touch them, Thomas. And I love that we have an all-powerful and everlasting God, and a holy and righteous God, and one that is just, but also the one that is good and understands us in our place of weakness. Like in Philippians 2, the kenosis passage, the pouring out passage, we learn that it says, like, Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be attained, something to be held on to. And even though Jesus was 100% God, he came to serve, to live like us, to empathize with us. And those passages as believers should, one, just make us such humble followers of Jesus, that's how he chose to live. And we have access to this holy and righteous and just God. And Jesus has done that for us, and that should well up within us, yes, humility, but also this sense of just how loved and cared for we are by this righteous, holy, and awesome God. And then he goes on and says, Lord, you have ordained them as judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. He's like, you're the strong one. You do not move. You are everlasting. You have foreknowledge. You are sovereign. And he's saying, you've ordained them, God. I know this is your plan. I know you see the long scope of history. You see the long scope of my current situation and of my life and of history in the world. He goes, you, and then Habakkuk continues on. We're in verse 13. You who are of purer eyes to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? He's like, God, I know you're sovereign, but let me say this one more time. How are you going to use a more wicked nation to correct a slightly wicked nation? He's saying, look at the Babylonians and how bad they are. How are you going to use their treachery? How are you going to use their awfulness to correct this nation, my nation, your chosen people, when they're that bad? And so he still's got issues. He still has issues with God's plan. And I don't think we're any different, are we? He said, you made mankind. This is where it gets kind of dark. Like, I'm not going to lie. And I'm going to start to move a little bit faster. He goes, you made mankind like the fish of the sea, like the crawling things that have no ruler. He paints this picture of people of like this fish who don't have a ruler, who don't have a king. He paints this picture of these creepy crawling things like spiders and bugs who have no formal governing system. They have no memory kind of the grand scope of things. They aren't worried about all of this, but just what's immediately in front of them. And he paints this pictures of mankind like that. And like that's how small we can be. And then he switches to talking about Babylon. And he says, he brings all of them with a hook, and he drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet. So he rejoices and is glad. And he's saying Babylon is bent on destruction. They're bent on conquest. They're going to hook some individually and go and get them, and then the rest they're just going to throw a net at and pull them. And they're disregarding these people as just like these swarming, non-ruled creatures. There's no regard for human life by Babylon. Habakkuk is coming to grips with what's going to come. And then he says, therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury. His food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his nets and mercilessly killing nations forever? And again, he's just going on about Babylon. He's saying they love to destroy so much that rumor has it, or history tells us that maybe the people, the Chaldeans, they worshipped like spears or weapons or swords, and like these weapons were these holy instruments that they would consider. That's how violent these people were. And he's like, they live in luxury. They just use people for their own purposes. There's no regard for human life other than theirs and maybe those that are close to them. They don't even regard these other nations as people. And then, so he's painting this doom and gloom about what he sees. Like, this is him. He knows, like, God is revealing to him what's going to happen. And then Habakkuk says this. He goes, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me, and I will answer concerning my complaint. And so Habakkuk says, God, I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait till I hear from you. I'm going to go out to my watchtower. And this is a repeated theme in the prophets of someone will go out and keep watch. And I believe this is symbolic. I mean, maybe you have a place. I certainly do in my life. It's out in the woods where I'll go and find a high point and I pray. And I sit quietly and I let God speak to me. So maybe the prophets were doing that as well. But there's also this symbolic idea that we just wait on God. We know he's sovereign. We know he's good. And we wait on him. And then so the Lord replies. He says, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. So this is interesting because we know a vision is coming to Habakkuk, but we never get to hear it. So I can't preach on it. But this last verse here, verse 4, is what I want to close with. He goes, behold, his soul is puffed up. He's talking about probably the king of Babylon at this time. It says, behold, his soul is puffed up, for it is not upright within him. But, this is our verse. This is what we're leaving on today. But the righteous shall live by faith. Fascinatingly enough, this verse in Habakkuk, obscure 3-chapter Habakkuk, is repeated 3 times in the New Testament. Romans 1:17, Galatians 3, verse 11, and Hebrews 10, verse 38. And let me remind us the truth of the gospel. Because as we look at our culture, as Habakkuk looked at his, we see violence, we see the government often, or we feel as if the government often fails us. We feel maybe as believers we don't know what to feel. We don't know how to proclaim the message of Jesus Christ in a world that's proclaiming so many other messages. We see lots of good messages to proclaim, but as followers we should seek to proclaim the best message there is. And so maybe you find yourselves, what do I do? How do I act? How do I proclaim the gospel of Jesus in a culture that seems so hard to proclaim anything and be heard? How do I do it with love and grace in a way that's respectful to the recipients? How do I live? How do I do this as a follower of Jesus? And it tells us here, but the righteous shall live by faith. And I think is like so often, as I've mentioned before, is like we want God to reveal us, the next 10 steps or the next 10 days or 10 months or 10 years in front of us. But sometimes the revelation we get is just the revelation of the one step in following Jesus. So let me recap with this. Christians and followers of Jesus are saved by grace through faith. And we as followers of Jesus walk in faith. And it's this faith in Jesus Christ that makes us righteous. It's this faith in Jesus Christ that is the message we have to have and we have to proclaim, because it's Christ's righteousness that saves us. It's Christ's righteousness that sustains us. And so last week I went into the Scott's home church, and Larry looked at me and with a big grin on his face. He goes, "Now, Nick, how are you going to get good news out of Habakkuk?" And in a powerful way, that home church conversation, we actually wrapped up there at the last part of Habakkuk, just talking about the goodness and the sovereignty of God. And so I want to encourage us as we hold fast that God is in charge, that God has this, that God's got this, as this week is election week, and I know we're going to hear that the end is near from lots of people. Oh my gosh, we're doomed. I'm going to move to Canada, or something like that. Like there's going to be a lot of doom and gloom this week. We are a people of the citizenship of God first. We proclaim the message and gospel of Jesus Christ continually, and he has given us the faith to sustain us to do that. And so let us be a people that rest in those truths. I'll be praying for you this week. Pray for each other in your home churches right now. If you're joining us on Facebook this week for the first time in a long time, it's great to have you again. If you're joining us on YouTube or anything like that and need more information, check out www.fellowshipweaverville.com. There's a connect card on there that you can easily access. Fill that out, and we'd love to follow up with you, reach out to you about how you can further connect to our church. Church, we love you. I know you love each other and care for each other during this time. Let's keep doing the work of the gospel.